northern Wisconsin. Late October, 1887. If you walked past Merrick cabin that autumn, you'd stop and stare. Stretched across his yard, from the cabin door to his woodpile, was a canvas corridor that looked like a tent had given up and fallen sideways. The heavy duck cloth sagged between rough-cut posts, stained dark from rain, flapping weakly in the wind. It was ugly. It was strange. And everyone who saw it had an opinion. The neighbors called it wasteful, good canvas ruined on a fool's errand. The town's most respected carpenter called it dangerous, a design that would trap moisture and rot every stick of wood beneath it. Even Merrick's own wife wondered, quietly, if he'd lost his mind. But what none of them understood, what none of them could see from the outside, was that Merrick Caldwell wasn't building shelter for himself. He was building it for his fuel. And in Frontier, Wisconsin, in the winter of 1887, fuel wasn't just important. It was everything. Wet firewood meant a cold cabin. A cold cabin meant sick children. Sick children, in a place 20 miles from the nearest doctor, meant the kind of fear that kept you awake at night, feeding a smoky fire that produced more coughing than heat. Dry wood, on the other hand, meant survival. It meant warmth that lasted through the night. It meant meals cooked hot. It meant your family didn't have to sleep in their coats. This is the story of how one man's useless canvas tunnel became the most copied innovation in 3 counties. How a solution that looked like madness turned into the standard that everyone followed. And how the thing that provoked the most mockery ended up saving more families than anyone wanted to admit. If you want to see one Frontier hack every week that actually worked when life depended on it, techniques that people bet their survival on, hit that subscribe button right now. Because I'm bringing you the real stuff, the tested stuff, the innovations that didn't come from books but from desperation and brilliance. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to know what part of the world is learning this with me. Merrick Caldwell wasn't the type to chase attention. He was a timber cruiser by trade, the kind of man logging companies hired to walk miles into uncut forest and mark the best trees for harvest. He'd measure diameter, estimate board feet, blaze marks in a bark, and move on. Quiet work. Solitary work. The kind that suited a man who preferred trees to conversation. He lived with his wife Sarah and their 2 daughters, Emma, age 8, and Clara, just 5, in a cabin he'd built himself 3 years earlier. 16 feet by 20 feet of hand-hewn oak, chinked with moss and clay, with a stone hearth on the north wall, and 2 small windows facing south to catch what little winter sun made it through the pines. It wasn't much, but it was theirs, and it was warm when the firewood was dry. That was the problem. October 1887 came in cold and wet. Not the kind of autumn rain that passes through in a day or two, but the kind that settles in and refuses to leave. 3 solid weeks of it. Cold, heavy rain that turned the dirt yard to mud and soaked through canvas tarps like they weren't even there. The sky stayed low and gray, and the temperature hovered just above freezing, warm enough to rain, cold enough to make you miserable. Merrick's woodpile sat 20 feet from the cabin door. He'd stacked it in the spring, 4 cords of split oak and maple, arranged in neat rows, ready for winter. Good, dense hardwood that should have burned hot and slow. But now, after 3 weeks of rain, the entire pile was saturated. The outer layers were black with moisture. The inner layers, trapped against the cold ground, never got a chance to dry. When he split a piece open, water beaded on the fresh surface. Wetwood doesn't burn. Not really. You can get it to smolder if you pack enough kindling around it, but it won't catch flame. It just sits there in the firebox, weeping steam, choking the draft, filling your cabin with thick white smoke that burns your eyes and throat. Every morning, Merrick would carry an armload of wet wood inside. He'd arrange kindling, dry stuff he'd saved from the previous year, and get a fire started. The kindling would catch, the flames would look promising, and then the wet wood would smother everything. He'd open the damper all the way, trying to pull more air through, but wetwood doesn't care about air. It just steams. Sarah started coughing. Not a little cough, a deep, rattling thing that kept her up at night. The smoke hung in the cabin because the wetwood wouldn't produce enough heat to create a strong draft. It just smoldered, and the smoke had nowhere to go but into their lungs. The girls complained that the cabin never got warm, and they were right. Wet wood produces maybe half the heat of dry wood, sometimes less. Merrick would feed the firebox every 30 minutes, and the cabin would still hover around 50 degrees, cold enough that you could see your breath in the corners farthest from the hearth. He started waking up at 2 in the morning to restart fires that had died. He'd stumble out of bed, crack open the firebox, and find nothing but cold ash and a half-charred log that had refused to burn. He'd rebuild from scratch, kindling, small splits, more wet wood, and the cycle would start again. His neighbors were suffering the same problem. Most of them had covered woodsheds, 3-sided structures with a roof, open on one side for access. The thinking was simple. Keep the rain off the top, let the sides breathe. But it didn't work. Rain blew sideways in Wisconsin. Wind drove it under the roof. Snow drifted in through the open side and melted against the wood. The logs closest to the weather stayed wet. The logs in the back, stacked against cold earth, absorbed ground moisture and never fully dried. Merrick visited his neighbor, a trapper named Elliot Brennan, to borrow a saw. Elliot's cabin was thick with smoke, and his wife was wrapped in blankets despite the fire. "Wet wood?" Merrick asked. Elliot nodded, coughing. "Going through twice as much as I should. Can't get it to burn clean." "You?" "Same." They stood there in silence, two men who knew the problem but didn't have the solution. The settlement's answer was straightforward. Cut more wood. If you're burning twice as much, then you need twice the supply. Suffer through the wet months. Wait for the cold, dry air of deep winter to pull the moisture out. That's what men did. That's what had always been done. But Merrick kept thinking about it differently. The problem wasn't volume. He had cords of wood. The problem was that his fuel was absorbing water faster than the autumn air could remove it. He needed protection from the weather, yes, but he also needed active drying, some way to pull moisture out of the wood before it went into the stove. He didn't have money for a lumber shed. A proper structure would take hundreds of board feet, and lumber was expensive. He didn't have time for stone or brick. A masonry storage building was weeks of work, and winter was coming fast. What he had was a problem that was making his family sick. And what he had was an old canvas tent, ripped down one side during a summer windstorm, bundled in the corner of his cabin. Not enough canvas to make a new tent. Too much to throw away. And he had 20 feet of mud between his door and his firewood. The idea didn't come all at once. It came in pieces over days, while Merrick walked back and forth between the cabin and the woodpile. 20 feet. That's all the distance was. But in freezing rain, 20 feet might as well be a mile. Every trip meant wet shoulders, wet hands, wet firewood. He'd grab an armload of split oak, and by the time he reached the cabin door, water was dripping down his sleeves and soaking into the wood he carried. He'd set it by the hearth to dry, but it would take hours, sometimes a full day, before the surface moisture evaporated enough of the wood to catch flame. One morning, while making his fourth trip of the day, Merrick stopped halfway between the cabin and the pile. Rain hammered his hat. Water ran down the back of his neck. And he thought, what if I didn't have to get wet every time I needed fuel? He looked at the canvas tent bundled in the corner of his cabin. 10 feet by 12 feet of heavy duck cloth, the kind they use for wagon covers and military tents. It had ripped along one seam during a summer storm, a tear too long to patch properly. Not enough fabric to make a functional tent, but maybe enough for something else. What if he didn't need walls? What if he just needed a roof, a covered corridor from the cabin to the woodpile? The next morning, he started building. He gathered materials from what he had on hand. Scrap lumber from an old fence, saplings cut from the tree line, rocks from the creek bed. He didn't have a plan drawn out, just a vision of keeping the rain off the wood and off himself. He drove 2 parallel lines of stakes into the ground, running from his cabin door straight to the woodpile. The lines were 7 feet apart, wide enough to walk through comfortably with an armload of wood, narrow enough that the canvas would have a steep pitch. He spaced the stakes every 6 feet, using a combination of wooden posts and thicker saplings, anything sturdy enough to hold tension. Then came the tricky part, the frame. He needed height and slope. If the canvas sat flat, it would collect water and snow, and the weight would pull the whole structure down. So he used longer posts at the cabin end, about 7 feet tall, and shorter posts at the woodpile end about 5 feet. This created a gentle downward slope, enough to shed water, but not so steep that the canvas would slide off. He lashed crossbeams between the posts using rope and rawhide strips, creating a ridgeline that ran the length of the tunnel. Then he stretched the canvas over the frame, draping it from the ridgeline down both sides. The heavy cloth fell in loose panels, reaching almost to the ground on each side. It looked terrible, a saggy, rain-stained corridor of canvas that seemed to droop more with every gust of wind. But Merrick kept working. He anchored the bottom edges using rocks and pieces of firewood, pulling the canvas taut enough to hold shape, but not so tight that wind would rip it. He reinforced the high end where it met the cabin wall, attaching the canvas to the eaves so rain wouldn't pour down the gap. At the far end, he left the canvas open, creating an entrance to the woodpile. The whole structure took him 2 days to build. When he finished, he stepped back and looked at what he'd made. It was ugly, improvised, and nothing like any woodshed he'd ever seen. But it had features that weren't obvious from the outside, features that came from thinking about how air moves and how heat behaves. First, the tunnel created a protected airspace above and around the woodpile. Rain couldn't reach the wood. Snow couldn't drift onto it. But air could still circulate through the open end and through the gap between the canvas and the ground. This was critical. Wood doesn't dry in stagnant air. It dries when moving air carries moisture away. Second, the steep pitch of the canvas meant that snow and rain would run off instead of accumulating. The weight of wet canvas was one thing. The weight of wet canvas plus 6 inches of snow was something else entirely. Third, and this was the part Merrick hadn't fully planned, but noticed immediately, the tunnel ran along the south side of the cabin. This meant it caught whatever sunlight broke through the clouds. More importantly, it sat close enough to the cabin wall that residual heat from the chimney and the heated logs inside drifted into the tunnel space. Not much heat, maybe 5 or 10 degrees warmer than the outside air, but enough to make a difference. What Merrick had built, without fully realizing it first, was a passive solar kiln. A space where wood could dry faster than it would in open air, protected from moisture while still exposed to ventilation. The first time he walked through the tunnel to grab firewood, the canvas flapped and cracked in the wind. But his shoulders stayed dry. His hands stayed dry. And the wood he pulled from the pile, wood that had been undercover for only 2 days, was noticeably different. The surface was no longer wet to the touch. When he split a piece open to check the interior, he could see that the outer inch had already started to dry. He brought an armload inside and built a fire. The kindling caught. The flames took hold. And for the first time in 3 weeks, the wood burned clean. No steam, no smoldering, just steady, crackling heat that filled the firebox and pushed warm air into the cabin. By the end of the first week, the difference was undeniable. Wood that had been soaked in October was burning hot in early November. The cabin stayed warmer. The smoke cleared. Sarah's cough started to ease. Merrick split a piece of oak that had been under the tunnel for 5 days and compared it to a piece from outside. The protected wood was already 20% lighter, measurably drier. He held both pieces over the stove. The outside piece steamed immediately. The tunnel piece didn't. The physics were simple, even if Merrick didn't use those words. Moving air plus mild heat plus protection from precipitation equals accelerated drying. It's the same principle behind a smokehouse or a hay barn or a covered bridge. You're not trying to create an oven. You're just creating conditions that let natural processes work faster. But nobody else saw it that way. All they saw was canvas hanging in the yard like laundry that forgot to come down. The first person to see the tunnel was Elliot Brennan, the trapper who lived a quarter mile down the trail. He stopped by 3 days after Merrick finished building, looking to borrow a crosscut saw. He walked into the yard, saw the canvas structure, and just stopped. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just stared, head tilted, like he was trying to figure out what he was looking at. "Merrick," he finally said. "What in God's name is that?" "Keeps the wood dry," Merrick replied, not looking up from sharpening an axe blade. Elliot walked closer, ducking his head to look under the canvas. He could see the woodpile at the far end, protected from the drizzle that was currently falling. He straightened up, shook his head, and laughed. Not meanly, but the way you laugh when someone's done something so odd you don't know how else to react. You build a tent. To your woodpile. Built a cover, Merrick corrected. You scared to walk 20 feet in the rain? Merrick stopped sharpening and looked at him. You spending all day trying to light wet wood? Elliot's smile faded a little. Because yes, he was. They all were. But the solution wasn't to build something this strange. The solution was to endure. That's what men did. Suit yourself, Elliot said, taking the saw. But when that thing blows down in the first good wind, don't say, I didn't warn you. Within a week, half the settlement had heard about Merrick Caldwell's canvas tunnel. People started coming up with names for it. Caldwell's canvas coffin was the most popular. One of the loggers, a loud man named Jack Torrance, called it the retreat, implying that Merrick had built himself a place to hide when his wife got tired of him. Another man, a young homesteader named Peter Hollis, joked that it looked like Merrick was setting up for a traveling show, but had forgotten to bring the performers. Every time someone made a comment, others would laugh. Not cruel laughter, exactly. Just the kind of laughter men use when someone's done something they don't understand and don't think is worth trying to understand. The mockery was mostly lighthearted, the kind of ribbing that frontier men gave each other about everything from crooked fences to poorly plowed fields. But it changed when Oswald Pruitt saw it. Pruitt was the settlement's master carpenter. He'd been building structures in northern Wisconsin for 15 years. Homes, barns, churches, a schoolhouse that still stood straight after a decade of hard winters. If you wanted something built properly, you asked Oswald Pruitt. And if Pruitt told you something was wrong with your construction, you listened. He came by on a cold afternoon in mid-November, not to borrow anything, but because he'd heard about the tunnel and wanted to see it for himself. Merrick was splitting wood when Pruitt arrived, walking slowly around the canvas structure, examining it from every angle. Merrick wiped sweat from his forehead and waited. He knew what was coming. Pruitt crouched down, looking at where the canvas met the ground. He stood up, pulled on one of the support posts to test its stability. He walked to the far end and looked at how the canvas attached to the cabin wall. Then he came back to where Merrick was standing. This is going to rot your wood, Caldwell. Merrick had expected criticism, but not that. What do you figure? You're trapping moisture. Canvas doesn't breathe like lumber does. That would under there's going to mold. You'd be better off leaving it in the open where air can get to it properly. Air's getting to it, Merrick said. Whole thing's open on one end and ventilated along the bottom. Pruitt shook his head. I've been building for longer than you've been in Wisconsin. I've seen men try shortcuts like this. They always fail. That canvas is going to sag, hold water, and when it does, you'll have wet fabric sitting on wet wood, and the whole pile will turn to rot. He pointed at the support posts. And those stakes? For a strong wind, this whole thing's coming down. You've got no proper foundation, no lateral bracing, just poles stuck in soft ground. Merrick felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. What under there's been drying for a week. Burns cleaner than anything I've split this season. For now, Pruitt said, wait till winter really hits. Wait till you get 3 feet of snow on that canvas and the wind's blowing 30 miles an hour. You'll see. He turned to leave, then paused and looked back. You know what your real problem is? You're overcomplicating a simple thing. Wood dries when you stack it properly and give it time. You don't need tricks. You just need patience. After Pruitt left, the tone of the mockery changed. It wasn't just jokes anymore. People who had thought the tunnel was merely odd now thought it was foolish, maybe even dangerous. Pruitt's opinion carried weight. If he said it was a bad idea, then it probably was. Sarah brought it up that evening while they were eating supper. The girls had already gone to bed, and the cabin was quiet except for the fire crackling in the hearth. Maybe we should take it down, she said quietly. Merrick looked up from his plate. Why? People are talking. They're saying it's going to fail, that it's going to make things worse. Wood's drying faster than it ever has, Merrick said. You notice we're not coughing anymore? You notice the cabin's warmer. I know, but Oswald Pruitt builds the same way everyone else builds. Merrick interrupted, more sharply than he intended. He softened his voice. I'm not saying he's wrong about everything, but he's wrong about this. Sarah was quiet for a moment. What if the wind does knock it down? Then I'll put it back up. What if the wood rots? It won't. It's drying, Sarah. Actually drying. I've been checking it every day. She looked at him, and he could see the worry in her eyes. Not worry about the wood or the tunnel. Worry about what it meant to be the family that everyone thought was doing something stupid. They're laughing at us, she said. Let them laugh, Merrick replied. They'll stop when winter gets here. But he wasn't as confident as he sounded. Doubt has a way of seeping in, especially when it comes from people you respect. And Oswald Pruitt wasn't just anyone. He was a man who knew construction, who'd built things that lasted. What if Pruitt was right? What if the tunnel was a mistake, a waste of material and effort that would fail when the real cold arrived? Merrick lay awake that night, listening to the wind test the canvas. He could hear it snapping and pulling against the ropes. He thought about taking it down, going back to the normal way of doing things. Suffering through wet would like everyone else, accepting that this was just how winter worked. But then he thought about Emma's cough, which had finally stopped. He thought about the clean-burning fires that now heated their cabin without filling it with smoke. He thought about the wood he'd split that morning, wood that had been saturated 3 weeks ago and was now dry enough to light with a single match. The tunnel worked. He knew it worked. And when winter truly arrived, when the real test came, everyone else would know it too. He just had to wait. The real cold came in late November. Not the kind of cold that makes you put on a coat. The kind that makes you question whether you've prepared enough, whether you have enough food stored, enough wood split, enough faith that you'll make it to spring. It started with the wind. A north wind that came down from Canada, steady and relentless, pushing temperatures from the low 30s down to the teens, then down to single digits. The sky cleared, which should have been beautiful, but clear skies in late November meant no cloud cover to hold heat, and the thermometer kept dropping. Then the snow started. It began on November 28th, a Wednesday. Light flurries at first, the kind that dust the ground and melt by afternoon. But these didn't melt. They accumulated, and the next day brought more. And the day after that brought more still. By December 2nd, there were 14 inches of snow on the ground, and it was still falling. The temperature hadn't climbed above 15 degrees in 4 days. At night, it dropped below zero, the kind of cold that makes water buckets freeze solid, that makes the moisture in your nose freeze when you breathe, that turns your woodpile into a block of ice if you're not careful. Merrick's neighbors started struggling immediately. The problem wasn't just the cold. It was the snow. 14 inches of it, covering every woodpile in the settlement. Men had to shovel out their stacks before they could even reach the wood. And when they did reach it, they found logs coated in ice, frozen together in clumps that had to be pried apart with an axe. Worse, the wood that had gotten wet in October and early November, which was most of it, had frozen with moisture still inside. When you brought a frozen log inside and tried to burn it, the ice would melt, soaking the wood all over again. You couldn't win. The wood was either frozen solid or wet, and neither one burned worth a damn. Elliot Brennan came by on the third day of the storm, looking haggard. Snow caked his beard and coat. His hands were red and chapped from working in the cold. "You got any dry kindling?" he asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Merrick nodded and went to grab some from under the tunnel. When he came back out, Elliot was staring at the canvas structure. Snow had piled up on the sloped roof, but not much, maybe 3 inches, and it was already starting to slide off the steep pitch. Under the canvas, the woodpile sat dry and accessible, protected from the weather. "That's actually working," Elliot said, and it wasn't a question. It was a realization, said quietly, like he was talking to himself more than to Merrick. Merrick handed him the kindling. "Been working since I built it." Elliot took the wood, held it for a moment. It was light, bone dry, the kind of fuel that would catch on the first spark. He looked at his own woodpile, visible in the distance, a snow-covered mound that would take an hour to dig out just to reach wood that probably wouldn't burn clean anyway. "I might owe you an apology," Elliot said. "Still looks ridiculous," Elliot replied, but he was smiling a little. "But if it keeps working through the winter, well, I'll stop calling it a coffin." He left with the kindling, trudging through snow that came up past his knees. Merrick watched him go, then looked at his own setup. The tunnel had held. The canvas hadn't ripped, hadn't sagged dangerously, hadn't collapsed under snow. The stakes had stayed firm in the ground, even with the freeze. And inside, the wood was dry, genuinely dry, the kind of dry that only comes from weeks of protected storage and passive airflow. But Elliot wasn't the only one struggling. The entire settlement was suffering. Over at the Hollis place, young Peter and his wife were burning their furniture. They'd run through their outdoor wood in the first week of cold because it wouldn't burn efficiently. They were feeding the stove constantly just to keep the cabin at 50 degrees. Now they were breaking up chairs and bed frames, anything that had been indoors long enough to be dry. The Torrance family, who lived closest to the general store, had tried to buy extra wood from a supplier who hauled loads in from a lumber camp 15 miles south. But the roads were snowed in, and no one was getting through. They were stuck with what they had, which was a pile of frozen oak that produced more smoke than heat. Even Oswald Pruitt, the master carpenter who'd predicted Merrick's tunnel would fail, was having problems. His three-sided woodshed, built with proper lumber and a solid roof, had filled with drifted snow. The wind had pushed it through the open side, packing it around the logs. When Pruitt tried to pull wood out, he had to chip away ice first. And the wood itself, which had seemed fine in October, had absorbed moisture from sitting on cold ground through the wet season. Now, it was frozen and damp at the same time. The breaking point came on December 7th, when the temperature dropped to 11 degrees below zero. That was the night families across the settlement realized they were in real trouble. Fires that should have kept cabins warm through the night were dying out by midnight because the wood wouldn't hold a burn. People were waking up to cabins so cold that ice had formed on the inside of windows, and the water in the wash basin had frozen solid. At the Brennan place, Elliot's wife bundled their 3 children in every blanket they owned and kept them near the stove all night. The fire kept going out. The wood kept smoldering. By morning, the cabin was 42 degrees inside, cold enough to see your breath, cold enough that the children's fingers were going numb, even under the blankets. Elliot made a decision. He pulled on his coat, walked through knee-deep snow in the pre-dawn darkness, and knocked on Merrick Caldwell's door. Merrick opened it to find Elliot standing there, exhausted, his pride clearly fighting a losing battle with desperation. "I need to know how you're keeping that wood dry," Elliot said. "And I need to know if you'll help me build one." Behind him, in the growing light of dawn, other men were emerging from their cabins. They'd all had the same night. They'd all reached the same conclusion. And they were all walking toward Merrick's place, toward the canvas tunnel that they'd mocked for weeks, ready to ask the question they should have asked from the beginning. How does it work? Stay with me, because what happens next, the numbers that came out of this, embarrassed every expert who'd called this idea foolish. You're not going to believe the difference. Word spread fast in a small settlement, especially when survival was at stake. By mid-morning on December 8th, 7 men had gathered in Merrick's yard, standing around the canvas tunnel like it was a puzzle they needed to solve. Among them was Oswald Pruitt, who hadn't said a word yet, but was examining the structure with the kind of attention a man gives when he's trying to understand where he went wrong. Merrick walked them through it, explaining not as a man who'd proven a point, but as someone sharing information that might help. "The canvas keeps the weather off," he said, pointing to the sloped roof. "Rain, snow, it all runs off before it can soak through. But the key is that it's not sealed. Air moves through here." He gestured to the open end and the gap along the bottom. "That circulation is what dries the wood. It's not trapped moisture, it's protected exposure." One of the men, a homesteader named William Garrett, crouched down and pulled a piece of wood from under the tunnel. He hefted it in his hand, feeling the weight. Then he walked over to his own wood pile, still half buried in snow, and pulled out a comparable piece of oak. He held them both, one in each hand. "This one's got to be 20 pounds lighter," he said, holding up the tunnel-dried wood. "At least. Closer to 25% lighter," Merrick said. "Dry wood weighs less. That's how you know." Pruitt spoke for the first time. "Can I split one open?" Merrick nodded. Pruitt took a piece of oak from the tunnel, set it on a chopping block, and drove a wedge through it with a single strike. The wood split clean, and the inside was pale and dry. No dark moisture stains, no beading water. He did the same with a piece from Garrett's pile. That one split reluctantly, and when it opened up, the interior was visibly damp, almost gray. "That's the difference," Merrick said quietly. "That's what burns and what doesn't. They started comparing notes. Real numbers, measured experiences. Elliot Brennan had been tracking how much wood he was using. Before the snow came, he was going through about 1.5 armloads per day to keep his cabin at a livable temperature. Not warm, but survivable. After the snow and cold arrived with his wet frozen wood, he was burning 4 armloads a day and still struggling to keep the cabin above 50 degrees. His fire had to be fed every 45 minutes because the wood wouldn't hold a burn. Merrick, using tunnel-dried wood, was going through 2 armloads per day and keeping his cabin between 65 and 70 degrees. His fires burned for 2 to 3 hours before needing more fuel. The difference wasn't small, it was dramatic. Someone suggested they measure it properly, so they did. On the morning of December 9th, with the temperature holding steady at 8 degrees outside, 3 families agreed to a test. They'd all start fires at the same time, using the same amount of wood, 6 split logs of comparable size. They'd measure the temperature inside their cabins every 30 minutes for 4 hours. The Brennan cabin, using wood from an exposed pile that had been wet and then frozen, reached 54 degrees after 1 hour and stayed there for the rest of the test. Elliot had to add more wood 3 times just to maintain that temperature. The Garrett cabin, using wood from a covered but poorly ventilated shed, reached 58 degrees after 90 minutes and held it with 2 additional loads of fuel. The Caldwell cabin, using tunnel-dried wood, reached 68 degrees after 1 hour and climbed to 71 degrees by the end of the test. Merrick added wood once, after 3 hours, not because the fire was dying, but because he wanted to maintain the heat overnight. The difference was 20 degrees. 20 degrees warmer, using half the wood. But the real shock came when they measured efficiency over time. Someone, it might have been Pruitt trying to understand the mechanics, suggested they weigh the ash produced from burning the same amount of wood. Dry wood burns almost completely, leaving fine ash. Wet wood produces more waste, more creosote, more unburned material. After 1 week of burning, they compared. Merrick's stove had produced about 3 pounds of fine, light ash from burning an estimated 40 pieces of firewood. Brennan's stove, which had burned roughly 90 pieces in the same period, had produced 12 pounds of chunky, heavy ash mixed with half-charred wood fragments. The numbers told a story that couldn't be argued with. Merrick's wood was burning at roughly 75 to 80% efficiency. His neighbor's wood was struggling to reach 40%. "How long has your wood been under there?" Garrett asked, pointing at the tunnel. "The first batch went under in early November," Merrick said. "So about 5 weeks. But even wood that's only been under for 2 weeks burns cleaner than anything that's been sitting outside." Pruitt walked the length of the tunnel again, studying it from every angle. When he came back, he looked at Merrick with something that might have been respect or might have been frustration, probably both. "You're running about a 10-degree temperature gradient in there," Pruitt said. "Warmer near the cabin, cooler at the far end. And that slope means you've got natural convection pulling air through. It's crude, but it works." "It works," Merrick agreed. There was another number, too, one that became clear over the next 2 weeks. Wood that went into the tunnel wet could be burned effectively within 3 to 4 weeks. During the wettest part of autumn, Merrick had tested this specifically. He'd placed freshly split, rain-soaked oak under the canvas and marked the date. 26 days later, that wood was dry enough to burn clean. In open air during a Wisconsin winter, wet wood could take 10 to 12 weeks to dry, if it dried at all before spring. Most of the time, it just stayed damp, freezing and thawing in cycles, never quite reaching a burnable state. The numbers were undeniable. 20 degrees warmer inside 50% less would consume 75% burn efficiency versus 40% 4 weeks to dry versus 12 weeks fires that lasted 3 hours versus fires that died in 45 minutes, and one more number that mattered to everyone: 0 failures. The tunnel hadn't collapsed. The canvas hadn't rotted. The stakes hadn't pulled out. The structure that everyone said would fail in the first hard wind had survived 2 weeks of blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, and constant snow. Garrett was the first to say it out loud. "I'm building one. Tomorrow. I'll help," Elliot said. Pruitt stood there for a moment longer, looking at the tunnel with the expression of a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. Finally, he nodded. "I was wrong," he said simply. It's not pretty, but works better than anything I've seen. Coming from Oswald Pruitt, that wasn't just an admission. It was a reversal, and everyone there knew it. By December 15th, 3 more canvas tunnels had gone up in the settlement. Elliot Brennan built the first one, using an old tarp he'd been saving and poles cut from young birch trees. His was shorter than Merrick's, only about 15 feet, but it followed the same principle: sloped roof, open ventilation, protected from weather. He placed it on the south side of his cabin, just like Merrick had. Within a week, Elliot's wood was drying. Within 2 weeks, his cabin was warmer. His wife stopped worrying about the children freezing at night. William Garrett built the second, and he improved on Merrick's design. Instead of canvas, he used overlapping cedar shingles on a light wooden frame. More permanent, but heavier and more expensive. It worked beautifully. The shingles shed snow even better than canvas, and the wood underneath stayed bone dry. The third came from a farmer named Henry Moss, who didn't have canvas or money for shingles. He used layered birch bark, the kind the Ojibwe had been using for generations, to waterproof their shelters. It wasn't as durable as canvas, but it cost nothing, and it kept the snow off his woodpile just fine. Each man adapted the idea to what he had available. That's how good design spread, not through rigid copying, but through intelligent adaptation. Peter Hollis, the young homesteader who'd been burning his furniture, built a hybrid version. He constructed a permanent 3-sided shed using lumber, then added a canvas extension that reached from the shed opening to his cabin door. It gave him both storage and a dry corridor. He told Merrick it was the best of both worlds. Even Oswald Pruitt, the man who'd called the idea foolish, made changes to his setup. He didn't build a tunnel. His pride probably wouldn't allow a direct copy, but he added a sloped canvas roof over his existing woodshed and closed off 2 sides with scrap lumber to reduce wind penetration. It was different enough to be his own design, but the principles were pure Merrick Caldwell. The adaptations kept coming. One man added ventilation, holes along the ridge line of his canvas to increase airflow. Another built a double-layer roof with an air gap between for better insulation. A third constructed his tunnel wide enough that he could stack wood on both sides of a central walkway, doubling his storage capacity. The settlement's blacksmith, a Norwegian immigrant named Gunnar Halvorsen, built something different entirely. He created a covered corridor that connected his cabin to his smithy, running past his woodpile on the way. It served 3 purposes: dry passage between buildings, wood storage, and a place where residual heat from the forge could help dry fuel even faster. It was brilliant, and it showed how a simple idea could evolve when people started thinking creatively. By late January 1888, 12 homesteads within a 30-mile radius had some version of a covered wood storage system. Some were canvas tunnels. Some were shingled corridors. Some were hybrid designs that combined elements from multiple sources. But they all traced back to that rainy October morning when Merrick Caldwell had looked at an old tent and thought, "What if I don't need walls?" The social shift was just as significant as the technical adoption. In early November, Merrick had been the odd one, the man doing something strange that everyone assumed would fail. By January, he was a reference point. People didn't ask him for permission to copy the design. They just built their own versions and then stopped by to show him, looking for approval or suggestions. "I angle mine steeper," one man would say. "Shed snow better. I used double canvas on the north side," another would mention. "Blocks more wind." Merrick would nod, examine their work, offer small improvements. The tunnel had stopped being his personal solution and had become community knowledge, something everyone now understood and could modify to fit their needs. The mockery had vanished completely. In its place was something more valuable: respect earned through results. No one called it Caldwell's coffin anymore. They called it the wood tunnel or the canvas shed, or sometimes just the setup, set in a tone that implied everyone knew what you meant. The women noticed a change, too. Sarah Caldwell mentioned to Merrick one evening that the other wives had stopped giving her pitying looks at the general store. Now they asked questions. "How much canvas did you use? How do you keep it from sagging? Does it really make that much difference?" And the answer was always yes. Yes, it makes a difference. A difference you can measure in degrees and arm loads and hours of sleep. You don't have to interrupt to restart a dying fire. By the time spring arrived, the innovation had become standard. New families moving into the area would ask the established homesteaders for advice on setting up their properties, and someone would always mention, build a cover for your wood. Doesn't matter if it's canvas or shingles or bark. Just get it off the ground and out of the weather. Keep air moving through, and you'll burn half as much while staying twice as warm. The phrase that became common was simple: do it the Caldwell way. Not because Merrick had insisted on credit. He never did. But because everyone knew where the idea had come from, and in a community where survival depended on shared knowledge, that kind of innovation didn't get forgotten. It got honored by being used. In February 1888, a traveling journalist from Milwaukee made his way through northern Wisconsin, documenting how frontier families survived the brutal winter. He'd heard about the settlement's unusual approach to firewood storage and wanted to see it for himself. He interviewed Merrick in his cabin, which was warm, genuinely warm, despite the fact that it was 12 degrees outside and the wind was howling through the pines. "What made you think of it?" the journalist asked, pencil poised over his notebook. Merrick thought about it for a moment. "Didn't think of it all at once," he finally said. "Just kept watching my family get cold and I would stay wet. And I tried something different. And when people said it wouldn't work," Merrick smiled a little. "People say a lot of things. Wood doesn't lie. If it's dry, it burns. If it's wet, it doesn't. I figured I'd let the wood do the talking." The journalist wrote it down, though Merrick suspected he was making it sound more profound than it really was. The truth was simpler. He'd seen a problem, tried a solution, and adjusted it until it worked. That wasn't genius. That was just paying attention. But what Merrick understood, what the journalist article would later help others understand, was that the tunnel wasn't really about canvas or stakes or clever construction. It was about understanding what wood needs to dry and creating conditions that allow it to happen faster. The physics were straightforward, even if most people didn't think of them in those terms. Wood is hygroscopic. It absorbs and releases moisture based on the humidity and temperature of the surrounding air. In wet weather, exposed wood absorbs moisture. In dry weather, it releases it. The problem in Wisconsin wasn't just the rain and snow. It was that the wet season and the cold season overlapped, meaning we got soaked in autumn and then froze before it could dry. The tunnel solved this by creating a microclimate. The canvas blocked precipitation while allowing air circulation. The slope ensured snow didn't accumulate, and the proximity to the cabin's south wall meant the space stayed a few degrees warmer than ambient temperature. Not hot, but warm enough that moisture could evaporate even in freezing weather. It was passive solar drying, though Merrick had never heard the term. It was the same principle behind smokehouses, hay barns, covered bridges, and a dozen other structures humans had been building for centuries. The innovation wasn't new science. It was applying old wisdom to a specific problem in a specific place. And that was the real lesson, the one that extended far beyond Wisconsin in 1888. Traditional knowledge, the kind that gets passed down through generations, the kind that often looks crude or outdated, is almost always rooted in sound principles. When a Norwegian farmer builds a woodshed with a steep roof and open sides, he's not being superstitious. He's working with gravity, airflow, and moisture management. When a Native American tribe constructs a covered drying rack for fish, they're using convection and ventilation. When a frontier homesteader improvises a canvas tunnel, he's creating a kiln. The modern tendency is to assume that if something looks primitive, it must be inferior. That newer is always better. That expertise comes from formal training rather than from observation and iteration. Oswald Pruitt was a skilled carpenter, and his knowledge was valuable. But he'd been trained to build structures a certain way, and when he saw something different, his first instinct was to reject it. Not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't familiar. Merrick didn't have formal training. What he had was a problem that needed solving and a willingness to try something that looked ridiculous if it might work. He wasn't trying to innovate. He was trying to keep his family warm. The innovation was a side effect. By spring 1888, the wood tunnel had become so common in the region that no one thought of it as unusual anymore. It was just how things were done. And when new families arrived and asked why everyone stored their wood under canvas or shingles instead of in open piles, the answer was always the same. Because it works better. Better meaning quantifiable. Warmer cabins. Less wood consumed. Faster drying times. Fewer respiratory problems from smoke. Better sleep because fires lasted longer. Healthier children because cabins stayed warm. The journalist's article, published in late March, brought attention from other settlements. Letters arrived asking for details. How steep should the slope be? What kind of canvas works best? How far from the cabin should it extend? Merrick answered them all, often working with Sarah to write clear explanations. He never asked for money or credit. He just shared what he'd learned, the way frontier people had always shared knowledge that helped others survive. One letter came from a family in Minnesota who'd built a tunnel based on the article's description. They reported the same results: drier wood, warmer home, less fuel consumed. They also mentioned that they'd added a modification, extending the tunnel all the way to their barn so they could access livestock without walking through snow. The idea kept evolving. That's how good solutions spread. Not through patents or proprietary secrets, but through open sharing and intelligent adaptation. Someone sees a problem, finds a solution, and tells others. Those others modify it to fit their circumstances. The modification becomes an improvement. The improvement gets shared. The cycle continues. Merrick's tunnel wasn't the end of the story. It was a chapter in a much longer book about how humans figure out how to live in harsh places. Every generation faces the same basic challenges: staying warm, staying dry, staying fed, and every generation finds new answers to old questions. The canvas tunnel of 1887 became the attached woodshed of 1920, which became the insulated storage room of 1960, which became the passive solar design of 2000. The technology changed, but the principle remained constant. Protect your fuel, keep it dry, and you'll need less of it. On a warm day in April 1888, with the snow finally melting and the first hints of spring in the air, Merrick took down the canvas tunnel. The winter was over. The immediate need had passed, but he rolled the canvas carefully, stored it in the cabin, and left the stakes in the ground. Because he knew he'd need it again, and he knew, now that it worked. So here's my question for you. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever faced? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your stories about staying warm when it mattered most. And if you learned something from Merrick Caldwell's story, hit that like button and subscribe, because every week I'm bringing you another technique that real people used when their lives depended on getting it right. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.